Hey everybody! Today's stories may get a bit controversial. Leave your comments below. Who's right? Who's wrong? During the final trimester of my last year in high school, we had to do a group project that needed to be finished by the end of the trimester and was evaluated and graded in front of a jury of teachers, instead of an exam. I was paired with the biggest douchebag in class. Imagine a really entitled, arrogant a-hole. Every time we were supposed to work on the project, he would have some excuse to not show up and demand I would work on it alone to make sure the project stayed on track. In the beginning, I tried to complain and talk to the teacher, but she would just say make it work, it's your project. After a while, I stopped planning work meetings altogether. He would call me to ask how the project was going and I would say something like yeah, it's going well, I think it's almost finished or I'll send you the presentation to prepare for the jury. Little did he know, I had a trump card in my hand. The project counted for 40% of the final grade. Me, doing well in the class, already got about 55 of the other 60%, so even if I got a 0 on the project, I would still pass the class. The anus had less. A lot less. After it became clear he was just going to use my work to pass the class and the teacher didn't care, I decided to throw out all work for the project and keep the a-hole in the dark. That last bit went a lot easier than I expected, as he was happy with me telling him that everything was on track. In the last week before the jury presentation, things became harder. The butthole wanted me to send the presentation, so he knew which part he had to present. I managed to stall a few days with excuses, but 2 days before the jury presentation, I finally sent him an email with the PowerPoint, which was actually an MP3 file with a changed file extension. The next day, I turned off my phone. In the evening, I called him back with the excuse my phone had issues and he was panicking that there was something wrong with the PowerPoint. I told him not to worry, I will check it out tonight and have a working PowerPoint for tomorrow. I would come to the school at 8 a.m., so he could practice his part of the presentation before the jury appointment at 9 a.m. The next morning, I arrived at school a little before 9 a.m., having switched off my phone again. When he saw me, he approached me with a mix of panic and anger, but before I could explain anything, we were called into the room with the jury for our presentation. I just told the anus to not worry and let me do the talking. We greeted the jury and I started the introduction. The original idea of today was for us to present our project XYZ. But, since I already have enough points to pass the class and Mr. A-hole over here couldn't be bothered to put in any effort, I decided to skip it and, instead, have a nice day off today. That concludes our presentation, thank you for your attention. I just walked out on 4 confused teachers and 1 a-hole with a mouth open so wide, it looked like he was trying to eat a club sandwich vertically. Naturally, there was some backlash in the days after that. Teacher called for an explanation, but in the end recognized I was a good student and I indeed already passed the class without the project. A-hole was angry that he had to study over the summer for a re-exam. All in all, I was happy to have graduated and looked forward to going to college the next year. After the summer, I heard from friends that a-hole failed his re-exam and that, combined with other bad grades, caused him to have to redo his last year. Karma is a beach. I've lived in a lot of awful places throughout my college years, but this was one of the big ones. It's pretty long, just to warn you. I had recently moved into a house with 2 other girls. It wasn't the best house, but seemed to look okay for a college apartment. One of the girls had a friend who had lived there before, and told us that the landlord was sexist and kind of a dick, but usually meant well, and it was decent rent. I'll be referring to him as dumbass landlord. We were all broke, so we decided to sign a lease. I should have realized the warning signs when dumbass landlord wanted to sign it in a big boys, after he had just eaten dinner there, and the leasing agreement looking like he chopped it up from other pictures of lease agreements on Google. We also found this apartment as an ad off of Craigslist. Things were fine for a few months. I was living alone until the next school year would start, and wasn't home all the time since I would go over to my boyfriend's a lot and sleep over. It was a split house with an apartment in the basement, and ours on the first floor. It wasn't long until I started to notice things happening. We'd get a good amount of rain, since we were in the Midwest, by some big, local lakes, and it was springtime. We'd get a good amount of water, and the concrete steps to the house would consistently fill up with water I had to jump over, and it would disappear overnight. It also started to get a little bit of a musty smell in the house, and I had started coughing and sneezing all the time, but didn't know why. Soon, The other girls moved in, and we started having some difficulties with dumbass landlord. He wouldn't tell us when he'd come over to check on the property. He said he did this to keep up on looks and mow the lawn, but he did it way too often for any of us to be okay with. He would argue with us about having a copy of our own lease. He'd yell at us to give him rent payments in cash, especially before going to his cabin up north with his girlfriend. But the biggest of all was that we were having problems with mold, and he did not care. For a while, we hadn't talked to the people in the basement apartment, until everyone started having problems with dumbass landlord. We'd hear them arguing and yelling down below about as often as we would upstairs. But, they were in a hellhole. Everything they owned had mold growing on it. They had bugs everywhere, earwigs, beetles, ants, you name it. They were constantly throwing away their clothes, dishes, furniture, even their college papers and homework, since it was all growing mold. They spent money on plastic bins to hold most of their important items, but even those would get moldy. We also found out that they were supposed to have another roommate down below, but she couldn't live there from her allergies to mold after signing a lease agreement. We also found out that dumbass landlord verbally abused her and her mother on the phone, to the point where they were crying, and she couldn't get out of the lease. She ended up paying for 2 places every month so that she didn't have to live there, because he wouldn't let her break her lease, and didn't care. Upstairs wasn't as bad as the basement, but it wasn't good, either. All of us were coughing more and more each month. We would wake up coughing in the middle of the night, and we were getting really sick. We tried to air out the house as best we could, but nothing helped. I ended up getting a severe case of strep throat so bad, that every swallow I took made my eyes water, and made me verbally make noise from the pain. I tried to ask the doctor I went to if he could prove that this was from mold later, but he unfortunately couldn't give me a solid statement on it. Me, being a vocal, neutral good person, who was also going to school to be an architect, tried to explain to him what was going on in the house. No air circulation, his concrete steps and foundation walls were not sealed, so all of the water I'd have to jump over was most likely going into the basement walls, causing most all of the mold. We also found a few areas on the roof that needed patching, since we noticed some leaks, among other things. And the basement apartment had cheap, patio doors for their only means of entrance and exit, which would consistently be up against water when it rained, adding to the problem. Oh, smart dumbass landlord, decided that we were all just girls complaining about silly things that didn't mean anything, so he brushed us off, and said we were fine, even though I had told him that I was learning about these things in school, and knew what I was talking about. He wouldn't let us out of the lease, as hard as we tried. So all of us girls in both apartments decided we would get out, if it was the last thing we did. Then began researching all of the legal apartment and tenant information for our state and city to get out. We were paying for attorney fees, started taking pictures of the mold upstairs and downstairs that we could find, talking with several different city staff, and police, and started compiling this into a nice document. After deferring my rent payment to get a copy of the lease agreement from dumbass landlord, we could finally take a look at our legal document, and use that further to get out. We were also working with another landlord at a renting company in town, who I will call good ass landlord. He was, thankfully, doing his best to get us out of the crap hole, and into his apartment. Through him, we'd get all of the legal ins and outs of the renting business, and he would help us find a loophole. Then, after months and months of arguments, money, and researching, we found it. If we sent in a mold test to a research lab, and it was over the limit of what was inhabitable, we could get out. It was safe to say, we had a pretty good idea it was over the limit. The test came back a few days later, and we sent that off to the city, including our nice document of pictures, statements, and leasing agreements. Not even 4 hours went by, and we got a call from the city. Our house was so full of mold, that we were to move out of the apartment within 24 hours, and it was to be condemned. We were ecstatic. All of that hard work had finally paid off, although it was horrifying to know that the mold count was so high. The mold researcher who had been in the business for more than 30 years had not once seen a place with higher mold count than this house. Yes, this included black mold. Fast forward to us happily packing up in our house, all of our parents getting us out together, us moving into the apartment that good-ass landlord kept open for us to move into, and poor, old, dumbass landlord sobbing in our driveway as we happily stacked boxes into cars. Complaining that he should have paid more attention and listened to us, this was his girlfriend's property, and she's going to dump him. We all took a picture the next day, smiling in front of the condemned signs. It's still one of my favorite pictures to this day. Serves him right for not listening to his tenants. As for the aftermath of it all, apparently, the city knew about a lot of shady things he did. When we spoke to them, it seemed like he was an eye-roll landlord. They all knew of other problems he had with tenants, but no one had been able to do anything about it until us. He'd sneak his way out of things, since it was a really small town. Unfortunately, there weren't a lot of rules set in place for bad landlords, unless they did something really illegal, which is why we had a really hard time getting out of there. We could have sued, but it wasn't worth the money and time, since we were all graduating in a few months, and broke from speaking with lawyers. We did see what we could do about it, though. We just decided that getting out of the house and cutting ties would be the best, instead of dragging the situation out further. What did you think? What would you have done differently? Share your opinions in the comments. And if you enjoyed the stories, slap that like and subscribe button for more of them, and don't forget to support the original writers with an upvote. Links are in the description. Peace out, and catch you tomorrow.